Imagine you've done everything right. You pay your rent, you keep the place tidy, you keep yourself to yourself. You're not looking for trouble with anyone. And then your neighbour turns your life into a nightmare. Maybe it's drugs or threats, or a dangerous dog, or strangers turning up at all hours, banging on doors and shouting in the stairwell at 3 in the morning. Maybe it's all of it at once. So you do what you're supposed to do. You report it to the police, to your housing association, to the council. You keep a diary. You send the emails. You make the calls. And nothing changes. Weeks pass, months pass. You stop sleeping properly. You feel unsafe in your own home, the one place you're meant to feel safe. And eventually, you reach the point thousands of people in social housing reach every year, where you stop asking them to deal with the neighbour and you start asking something simpler. Can you just move me? It feels like the obvious answer. You're the victim, you've done nothing wrong. Surely, if your home has become unbearable through no fault of your own, they have to move you somewhere safe. Most people think the answer is a straightforward yes. The law says something much more complicated. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a real decision from 2026 where a resident asked for exactly that and was told no. But stay with me, because that no is not the end of the story. It's where understanding your actual rights begins. By the end of this video, you'll know where you really stand, what your housing association must do, what it might do, when it should seriously consider moving you, and the steps that genuinely strengthen your position. This is England. The rules are different in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and I'll flag that as we go. Let's get into it. Here's the case I mentioned. In 2026, the Housing Ombudsman looked at a complaint from a resident living in a small flat. She had an autoimmune condition and reported living with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. She was experiencing noise and harassment from a neighbour in the flat above. She felt unsafe. She temporarily moved out more than once. And she wanted two things: for the landlord to evict the neighbour and to be rehoused herself. The Ombudsman found that the landlord had followed its antisocial behaviour policy. It had agreed action plans, tried to gather evidence, worked with other agencies, and issued warnings to the neighbour. But there wasn't enough evidence to take formal enforcement action. And on the question of moving her, the Ombudsman's position was blunt. The landlord had no duty to rehouse her based on the evidence available to it. No duty to rehouse. That sounds devastating. If you're in the middle of this right now, it might sound like the system has completely failed you. But it doesn't mean you have no rights. It means your rights are not the ones most people assume. The big misconception is this: that being a victim of antisocial behaviour gives you a legal right to be moved. It doesn't. There is no law in England that says a housing association must rehouse you simply because your neighbour is making your life a misery. I know how unfair that sounds, but if we're honest about where the line actually sits, you can push in the right place, instead of exhausting yourself pushing where there's nothing to push against. So what does the law actually require? Start with what your housing association must do. Your landlord has a legal duty to have a published antisocial behaviour policy and to follow it. That comes from the Housing Act 1996, backed by the standards set by the regulator of social housing, which expect social landlords to have a proper approach to tackling antisocial behaviour in their neighbourhoods. Notice what that duty is. It's a duty to act properly. It is not a duty to move you. The gap between those two things is the whole subject of this video. When you report antisocial behaviour, the landlord's first job is to deal with the person causing the problem. That's the toolkit in the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014. Warnings, acceptable behaviour agreements, mediation, injunctions, and in the most serious cases, possession action against the perpetrator. The law's starting point is to deal with the person causing the problem rather than moving the victim. And that makes sense, because moving you leaves the next tenant with the same neighbour. Now, is a landlord ever legally forced to protect you from a neighbour or to move you? This is where people expect the courts to have their back. Generally, they don't. The UK's highest court has made it clear that simply being your landlord doesn't automatically make a housing association legally responsible for another tenant's behaviour. Even where serious harm was foreseeable, that on its own was not enough to create a legal duty to protect you. I tell you that not to depress you, but because it's the truth, and most content about this pretends otherwise. If we build your strategy on a duty that doesn't exist, we've wasted your energy. So where do your real levers come from? There are several, and this is the part worth understanding properly. First, the management transfer. Many housing associations operate what's often called a management transfer or management move policy. This is where the landlord uses its discretion to move a tenant out of harm's way in serious cases. Note that word, discretion. It's something the landlord may offer under its own policy, usually where there's a serious, evidenced risk to your safety. It is not something you have a legal right to demand. In practice, these policies tend to engage where the risk is real and documented, often where the police have confirmed you're at risk and need to move. And they weigh far more heavily where a child or a safeguarding concern is involved. Everyday friction and low-level noise rarely meet that bar. A credible threat of violence is a very different matter. Second, and this changes the most cases, your housing association and your council are not the same thing. This trips up almost everyone. People say the council and the housing association as if they're one body. They do different jobs. Your housing association is your landlord. Your council runs two separate systems that might help you move, and you can approach it about them even while your landlord deals with the antisocial behaviour. The first is allocations under Part 6 of the Housing Act 1996. Councils must run an allocation scheme that gives what the law calls reasonable preference to certain groups, including people who need to move on medical or welfare grounds, and people who'd suffer hardship if they couldn't move to a particular area. If the antisocial behaviour is affecting your health or your child's well-being, you may fall into one of those groups. But be careful what reasonable preference means, because it gets oversold badly. It does not mean you get a house. The courts have called it a head start, no more. You can have reasonable preference and still wait a very long time because there are more people in need than there are homes. It improves your position. It does not guarantee a move. There's also a second route through your council, if it's genuinely no longer reasonable for you to stay in your home. That's the homelessness system, and it's important enough that I'm covering it properly in its own video, rather than rushing it here. Third, if you're disabled, the Equality Act 2010 may strengthen your position. Let me be precise because this is easy to overstate. Being disabled does not automatically mean the landlord must move you. It can mean the landlord has to consider reasonable adjustments and think about how the antisocial behaviour and its own handling of it affects you specifically because of your disability. That can change what a reasonable response looks like. We've seen the impact on a vulnerable person or on a child's mental health tip a landlord towards agreeing a move it might otherwise have refused. Fourth, there's a formal tool called the ASB Case review. You might still hear it called the Community Trigger, its old name until 2023. It comes from that same 2014 Act, and I want to be exact, because people remember this one word for word. If you've reported ongoing antisocial behaviour and feel nothing effective has been done, you can demand a formal review that brings the agencies together. The threshold is set locally, but by law it can be set no higher than 3 qualifying complaints within a 6-month period, with each incident reported within a month of it happening. So in most areas, 3 reports in 6 months gets you a review. But understand what it is. It's a right to a review, not a right to be moved. It brings the council, the police, and your landlord to the table to look at how your case has been handled and what happens next. It's a powerful way to force attention onto a case that's been ignored. It is not a rehousing button. So here's the point of Act 2. Your landlord must deal with the antisocial behaviour properly and follow its policy. It may offer a management transfer at its discretion. The council, separately, may help you move through its allocation scheme. The Equality Act may strengthen your hand if you're disabled, and the ASB Case review can force your case back onto the table. What none of those is a simple legal right to be rehoused on demand. That right does not exist. Everything useful you can do flows from understanding that. So if this is happening to you right now, here's what actually helps. Not "it depends," real steps. 1. Keep reporting. I know it's exhausting when nothing changes, but a landlord can only act on what's recorded, and every report builds the pattern everything else depends on. Report each incident separately and promptly. 2. Gather your evidence. Dates, times, what happened, who else saw it. Keep copies of your reports and their replies, and any police crime reference numbers. This is what turns "I feel unsafe" into a documented case. 3. Ask for the landlord's antisocial behaviour policy in writing. Once you have it, you can hold them to their own words. And that is one of the most powerful things you can do. 4. Ask for a risk assessment. A properly run landlord should be assessing the risk to you and building an action plan. The failure to do one is among the most common things the Ombudsman criticises. 5. Ask in writing whether a management transfer has been considered. Don't demand a move as a right because it isn't one. Ask whether their policy has been considered in your case, and if not, why not? That puts the discretion on the record. 6. If you're disabled, say so clearly and explain the impact. Put in writing how your disability interacts with what's happening, and ask them to consider reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. 7. Approach the council separately. They're not your landlord. Ask the council's housing options team about the allocations scheme and whether you'd have reasonable preference on medical or welfare grounds. If it's genuinely no longer reasonable to stay, there's also the homelessness route, which I'll cover in the next video. Get proper advice either way from shelter, citizens' advice, or a housing solicitor. 8. If your landlord isn't following its own policy, complain and escalate. Use the landlord's formal complaints process first. If you're still not satisfied, take it to the Housing Ombudsman. This is the real lever. The Ombudsman usually can't force a landlord to rehouse you, but it repeatedly finds that failing to follow the policy, failing to assess risk, or ignoring a victim amounts to maladministration. That can mean orders to put things right and compensation. So, can your housing association rehouse you because of a neighbour's antisocial behaviour? Yes, they can. But in most cases, the law doesn't say they must. What the law does require is that they deal properly with the antisocial behaviour, follow their own policy, assess the risks, and make their decisions fairly. And if they don't do those things, that's where your power is. Most people spend months asking for something the law doesn't actually give them. The people who understand what the law does give them usually ask much better questions. And sometimes asking the right question changes everything. This is England only, and none of this is legal advice on your specific situation. So if you're in the thick of it, get proper advice from shelter, citizens' advice, or a housing solicitor. If this helped, and you want housing law explained honestly, without the myths, subscribe, because knowing your actual rights is the first step to using them.